excelsis Deo.
Hello and welcome to week 2 of Music Appreciation. The subject for this week is early music, but I want to begin by clarifying what I mean by early music and what the textbook author means by early music. Because if we were to just say early music, that has the potential to be misleading because it is far from the earliest music we have in regard to all of humanity. The music in this week starts around the year 600 CE, to 1000 CE and goes on from there. One of the oldest Babylonian instruments we have is 5,000 years old. It's a stringed instrument, so like a little harp. We have a flute made out of the femur of a bear that is tens of thousands of years old. So to say that it's early music, again, it's problematic, it's misleading. A better term would be early classical music or early Western European music. Another way to think about this is just the music that will become classical music. This is when it started. This is the earliest musical tradition that can be traced back from modern classical music. So what I'm going to be doing in this video is I'm not necessarily going to be introducing you to any ideas that are not the textbook. In fact, I won't be doing that at all. I will rather be going through the textbook and just highlighting a few of the key ideas, not necessarily the most important ones, but specifically the ones that I think would benefit from having it just be explained a little bit. Some of these concepts are very important, but I think they're pretty clear reading the textbook. So in order to be respectful of your time and not have this go on and on forever, I'm going to hit just some of the topics. However, as I mentioned, if you've already done the textbook reading and you feel that you understood all of it, then this is just going to serve as a review. So jumping in for Unit 2. The most important genre we're going to begin by talking about will be Gregorian chant, also called plain chant. This begins to appear around the year 600, Common Era, in Western Europe. However, we don't have a written record of it until around the year 1000, because that's when the church started producing music notation. The church was by no means the earliest people group to do so. We have music notation that dates back far earlier. The Bible itself has music notation that dates back to, we're really not sure, but perhaps the time of David and Moses. This is just the earliest European version, and it did evolve into what we use today, but it's very important to keep that in mind. So from the 600s, we have this plain chant, Gregorian chant. Plain chant just comes from simple. It's plain, it's simple, it's monophonic. So there's another video on monophonic music, the difference between monophonic, homophonic, polyphonic, and there's actually a fourth one. You will get into it in the textbook, but not for quite some time. But it's called heterophonic, and heterophony is usually associated with other cultures. Although there are some examples in Western music of heterophonic music. But just to keep that in mind, the other video does a great job explaining that. But we're talking about monophonic music at this point, one single line going through, and that's all there is. So Gregorian chant was named after Pope Gregory I, who was allegedly the one who, through divine intervention, categorized all these pieces of music. So it's a melody and it's lyrics, also called a cantus firmus, that you just can't alter. You can't change it because it's divinely inspired. Those were used as the foundation for these plain chants, and they will continue to be used for hundreds of years after this. We're using modes at this point. So a mode, for those of you who play piano or who play an instrument, modes are based off of the major scale. So there are 7 of them named after Greek cities or Greek groups of people because the Greeks were one of the earliest groups to use modes. So in order, we have Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian. You create these by taking the white keys only on a piano, so none of the sharps or flats. C to C, that's Ionian. D to D, that's Dorian. E to E, that's Phrygian, and so on. Modern music uses a binary system. All songs are classified, for the most part, as either major or minor, and while there are many ways to think about major and minor, one of the common ways is that major is happy and minor is sad. We had 7, though, back in this medieval time period. Actually, later in this lecture, we'll talk about when that shift took place. However, I don't want you to get the idea that modes are no longer used. We still use modes all the time in some genres. Heavy metal still uses modes all the time. Jazz still uses modes all the time. Even some more popular rock songs use modes. Another Brick in the Wall by Pink Floyd is in Dorian. Um, the last movement of the overture of Jesus Christ Superstar is in Phrygian. Enter Sandman, the beginning is also in Phrygian. So there are moments in modern popular music where you see these modes, but for the most part, they have kind of died off and been replaced by major and minor. However, even though there were 7 of them, you couldn't use all 7. The 7th mode, Locrian, you could not use if you were a composer. It lacked something we call a perfect fifth. For those of you who have studied music, you know what a perfect fifth is. For those of you who haven't studied music, just know that it's an important characteristic of most scales and most chords, and when it's not there, it just doesn't sound right. Because it had the wrong notes by one group of people's standards, they thought that it was the sound of the devil, and that it was evil, and that you couldn't write with it. So even though there were 7 modes, you could only write with 6 of them. Going through here, we have a few groups of people, specifically the troubadours and the minnesingers. So the troubadours and the minnesingers were basically the same type of I don't want to say career perhaps, or artist, but basically they're a group of people who wrote and performed their own music. Now, this is really important because later on in music history, there will be this division where some people are known for being composers and other people are known for being performers. You don't have to be both. You're not expected to be both. But these people were. The fundamental difference is that the troubadours were French and the minnesingers were German. But again, they did the same thing. Poems, music, they wrote it, they played it. By the end of this Middle Ages period, we start to see polyphony. So polyphony is when you have more than one voice singing at the same time. So that would be 2 or more people singing in harmony. Important to keep in mind, it's a cappella. So a cappella just means only voice. There can be many singers, but there are no instruments. There's no accompaniment. It's only one or many voices singing at the same time. We get the song form of a motet, so it's French form. Basically what a motet is this marks one of the earliest moments when the church is going to, when music is going to start to split from the Roman Catholic Church into secular music. Now, secular music has been going on all along, just like today. If we listen to music, the majority of the music we hear on the radio, on iTunes, on Spotify, is not Christian music. The same thing was true back then. The difference is people who were writing the music down were clergy members. So the only records we have are of Christian music. But at this point, the motets are important musically because they're one of the earliest indicators of that division where we're separating sacred and secular. But really, it's more of an indicator that we're just starting to write down secular music. So we have the Gregorian chant on the bottom, the bass part would sing that, and then we have a secular piece of poetry, a love song perhaps, sung on top. So 2 vocal lines happening simultaneously, which the textbook author does point out, we don't really have that nowadays. It's strange to imagine listening to 2 songs at once that really don't have much to do with each other. Please read through the global perspectives carefully. They're very interesting in contextualizing what's going on. Also, there will be quiz questions from the global perspectives, which I'm sure some of you have already realized. So now I'm going to talk about the Renaissance, which means rebirth for a moment, from the 14th to the 16th centuries, so 1300s to 1500s. One of the really interesting things about the Renaissance is most artistic time periods were labeled and categorized after the fact. But when the Renaissance began taking place, it was intentional. They knew they were doing something new. They were intentionally trying to recreate the glory days, so to speak, of the Greco-Roman world. Some of the most important figures of this time period would be Columbus, Leonardo da Vinci, Galileo, Shakespeare. So for medieval music, you basically started with the fall of Rome, of the Roman Empire, and led all the way to Christopher Columbus, discovering the New World. Whereas now we're talking about these other figures, this is when Columbus begins to arrive on the scene, Da Vinci, Shakespeare, King Henry VIII, which we'll talk about in a moment. So periodically I'm going to give you some other historical figures just to kind of tie in when all this is going on. This is going to be when the plague happens, and we'll expand on that as we go. We have early homophony. So now we've covered the three texture types that we'll cover for a long time. Monophony, monophonic music, homophonic music, which is this one, and polyphonic music. So homophonic music is when you have a voice singing a melody with accompaniment. So think of the song Yesterday by the Beatles, performed by Paul McCartney. It's just his voice and the acoustic guitar at the beginning. You have the main part of the melody with some accompaniment, in this case on a guitar. I also want to direct your attention to how the paintings have changed. As you look at this first page on the Renaissance, you start to notice it's much more detailed, it's much more realistic and lifelike. And the reason is that as we track the evolution of music throughout these classical periods, and we track changes in art and in painting and sculptures, as well as architecture, we notice a pattern where if you were to come up with a set of adjectives to describe the music of medieval music, of Renaissance, or of Baroque, and then you were to look at paintings from these time periods or architecture from these time periods, what's really remarkable is you'll probably find that you're using the same terms to describe them. And there's just this general aesthetic of each of these time periods which permeates all areas of art, including music, painting, etc. So keep that in mind. As you're listening to these songs, how would you describe them? What adjectives would you use? Now, then, look at the paintings in the book. Which adjectives would you describe those with? How are they changing? I think you'll notice that it's kind of tracking each other across art forms. It's during the Renaissance that the Mass becomes an important part of music. So the Mass is just the largest, most important prayer service of a Christian liturgy, so following that Christian liturgical calendar. As I mentioned, everything's a cappella at this point, just singing without accompaniment. We're starting to get homophony, but up until this point, it's largely been a cappella. We start to see word painting. So word painting, I think, is really interesting, and it started during the Renaissance, and it's so normal for us now that we don't really even think about it. Basically, word painting would mean, if, like, I'll just read you the example they use here. If the words like fly or glitter are sung, you would use musical ideas that convey that. So flying, you might have really high notes, or something quick, you might have really fast notes. If something's falling, you'd have the notes literally walk down. And in fact, the song Spoonful of Sugar from Mary Poppins intentionally went against word painting. They say, spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. The line, melodically, goes up when they say go down. That was intentionally breaking from word painting, which had persisted for so long. So we may not notice it because we all grew up and these songs were always around us, but at the time it was disconcerting for a lot of people, because when you say go down, you go down. You don't go down. Kind of see how that sounds funny when you do that. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I don't know. By the end, we have the Pope Marcellus Mass by Palestrina. Palestrina was involved in the Counter-Reformation movement, so by now Martin Luther is leading the Reformation, and of course, in a typical Protestant-based version of history, the Reformation is seen as a positive thing. Well, for the people that we're following, it's certainly seen as a negative thing, because this is all based off the Catholic Church. So Palestrina is one of the big figures that rejected the Reformation. Pope Marcellus Mass, think about that as being one of the most important works of the Renaissance time period. We have the madrigal. So a madrigal is interesting in that it's secular music. It's entirely secular music. So by this point, initially we had the motet. The motet was a combination of sacred and secular music. Now we have just secular music as a popular form. And again, that had been happening for a long time, but now it's being written down and recorded. That's what's happening, as secular, popular folk music is starting to seem important enough that it's worth writing down and remembering what's happening. There are two varieties of madrigals. So it began as an Italian art form, and it was just short composition with a few voice parts set to usually one stanza of a poem. And it was so famous, these Italian madrigals, that they worked their way to England and they were being sung in Italian. But Queen Elizabeth I, who was the daughter of King Henry VIII, who had the 6 wives, she decides that she wants English composers to write English madrigals. So by the time we get toward her death, and I want to say 1603 is when she died, but by the time we get to her death, we have this new art form of English madrigals, which she was pretty directly involved in. Fun fact about King Henry VIII, her father, this isn't proven, but many scholars suggest that he is the composer of the song Greensleeves, which is often sung around Christmas time. It's by this point that we start to have instrumental music taking off. We're going to come back to instrumental music in a moment and talk about why it became popular. But one area where I really want to credit the textbook author is his acknowledgement that these instruments were not coming from Western Europe. They were not inventions. So the lute, which was kind of the guitar of the 1500s, not only in that it's similar to a guitar, in that it's a stringed instrument which you pluck, and it has a body and a neck, but also it was, so many people play the guitar. I would say probably half of the country knows how to play a few chords on the guitar, and everyone knew how to play a lute at the time. However, a lute is a Middle Eastern instrument. It's called an oud, and it worked its way from the Middle East to Europe, and by this point, no one claims that the Europeans invented the lute, but they would say that they perfected it and made it a more, perhaps, structurally sound instrument than the Middle Eastern variety. They're basically the same thing. They're just tuned a little bit different, and the oud doesn't have frets, but other than that, they are the same. I used to play the lute for Disneyland, and I've also played an oud before, and the technique largely carries over between the two. One of the most important genres for Renaissance, and again, we're going to talk about instrumental music again in just a moment, but it was dance forms. So we think of dance forms like a waltz, for example, is a dance form as being strictly for dancing, but actually they're one of the most critical and important aspects of instrumental music. Okay, scrolling through. So now we're talking about, and as you can see, we're going very fast. You certainly have to read the textbook to get the whole picture. I'm just kind of pointing out some of these big ideas. So now we're finally in Chapter 8, talking about early Baroque music. And if it ain't Baroque, don't fix it. One of the worst jokes in music. No music jokes are good, but that one's particularly bad. Okay, so a few things are happening with Baroque music that are important. One is that they call it taboo dissonances, like that Locrian mode that had what we call an imperfect fifth. Those are now okay. So those rules that certain scales, certain note relations aren't allowed, those kind of all go out the window, and you can write whatever you want. And some of the most dissonant sounds are the best at conveying emotion. So you'll start to hear that Baroque music sometimes seems maybe more interesting to listen to, or at least can have more of an emotional impact on a song through the note choices. Extravagance and control. So Baroque music is known for its ornamentation. Extra fast, really crazy. The faster and better you can play, that's what's valued in music at this time. It's all about over-the-top playing. Not in a way that's distasteful. It's very tasteful. It's not overplaying, but that's what makes good Baroque playing, these ornamentation, these really fast trills on a piano. Well, they didn't have a piano yet, on like a harpsichord or a violin or on a lute. We finally get to the point where rhythm and meter begins to be much more important. Before this, everything was largely just sung however you wanted to sing it. The group would kind of stay together in a very loose fashion, but now it's rhythmic. 1 and 2 and 3 and a 4 and 1 and 2 and. Very metric by this point. And the Baroque music, just for you to keep that timeline in mind, now we're from the year 1600 to 1750, and we'll talk more about why it ends in 1750. Actually, there is a specific event that happens, which we'll talk about in week 3. We have a basso continuo, which is just a way of having a bass line that serves as a foundation that can be harmonized. We have an ostinato. Ostinato, or ostinati, might be the plural, is just a repeating bass figure. Ostinatos can be heard in all kinds of music today. Imagine any song where there's one hook that just keeps going on. That would be an ostinato. To use one of a very recent example, think of something like Old Town Road with that banjo lick. That just goes throughout the entire song, so that would be an ostinato. And when you get to the global perspectives part of this chapter, we're going to talk about the kora, which is that plucked string instrument, how there are ostinato patterns in Africa as well. And that's important because a motet is unique to Europe. Started in France but spread to Europe. But an ostinato, that can be found in music around the world. We have the beginnings of functional harmony. Functional harmony is a pretty complicated concept. If you are not a musician, this isn't one of those terms that you have to spend too much time on, but just think of that as being the rules of music theory. However, it also means that we've now split to major and minor. So Ionian, one of those modes, has been renamed major. Aeolian, another mode, has been renamed minor. The other 5, it's not that they're not used, but we're not focusing on them anymore. We're focusing on just those 2 that survived. And partly because we're allowed to use any notes we want now, so they don't have to limit themselves to trying to stay within one mode. It's also during this period, the early Baroque period, the opera comes onto the scene. So opera is amazing because we're telling stories with music. We're combining lyrics and singers with instrumental music, with extravagant costumes, sets, dancing, choreography. It's almost as if all of the arts are on display at once with the purpose of telling a story. We have another form, actually 2 forms, the recitative. It looks like it might be recitative, but it's actually pronounced recitative, and the aria. Aria is Italian, it's also known as an air in English, but we'll use the term aria for this course. So a recitative is really representative of what had been going on all along, where there isn't rhythm indicated, you just sort of sing the melody in an expressive, exaggerated way. This is exactly how music would have been performed in biblical times. The music notation of the Bible does not have rhythmic indications, it only has the melody. That's sort of like this recitative. However, the aria is a little bit more dramatic and embellished, and there's certainly a greater sense of rhythm. So now we're going to start talking about a few of these most important operas. So Monteverdi, one of the important composers, we have Orfeo. Orfeo is the Italian name for, or the Italian variation on Orpheus, which is a Greek story. So Orpheus and Eurydice, which was the woman his betrothed, his bride. Orpheus was the greatest poet and musician of his day, and Eurydice was this like wood nymph, kind of a fairy type creature, but also a person. They're supposed to get married on their wedding day. She is bitten by a snake and she dies, and she goes to the underworld or hell or Sheol or whatever you want to call it. She's dead, and Orpheus is just overcome with grief. He can't live without her. He decides he's going to go down to the underworld and he's going to retrieve her. So he starts to go down and he sees Cerberus, which is the 3-headed dog, and he starts playing his lyre because, again, he's this master musician, and the dog calms down. So in that opening scene of the first Harry Potter book and movie, that's where that comes from, where Hermione puts the enchantment on the harp and it starts playing. Orpheus played his lyre, and the 3-headed dog went to sleep. So then he gets to Pharon at the river Styx, which is the kind of like death figure that takes you across the river to meet Hades, which is like the god of the underworld, and Persephone, his wife. So he goes across, he begs to have Eurydice back, and Hades says, okay, I'll make you a deal. You can have her back, but you have to trust me, and you're going to walk out of the underworld all the way back up to Earth, and she's going to be behind you. You have to trust me that she's behind you. If you keep walking straight, you'll get up to Earth, and you can turn around, you can embrace, and she'll be yours, and get to live a long life together. But if you turn around, if you don't trust me, she's going to be locked down here forever, and you'll never see her again. So he starts walking, and he gets increasingly nervous as he walks because he's not hearing her. He calls out to her, she doesn't respond. He doesn't hear footsteps. He starts to think that this is a trick, and then once he gets out of the underworld, he'll never have a chance to get back down. And so when he's one step away from Earth, he finally turns around because he can't take it. What if he's wrong? What if he loses her? and sure enough, she was right behind him, but because he broke the rules of the agreement, she falls all the way back down to the underworld, and he has lost her forever. He can't get back. He is grief-stricken and goes on to, according to Greek legend and tradition, write some of the greatest Greek stories that we have, this figure, and then eventually he dies. So everyone dies, sad ending, but that's Orfeo or Orpheus, and this is one of the popular Italian opera versions. So again, that story, thousands of years old. This was just a, at the time, contemporary Italian retelling using opera. That was unfortunately the only opera of Monteverdi that we have. We also have Purcell, who was an English composer, and he has Dido and Aeneas. So this is kind of the stories that led to the beginning of Rome. So Dido is from Carthage, and Aeneas is this Trojan warrior. They fall in love, and they're beautiful, but this tragedy ends poorly. Anyway, that is considered the greatest, and some people say the only good, English opera before the 20th century. By the time we get to the 20th century, we have a ton of English operas and pieces of musical theater. But a lot of music scholars say we only had one before the 20th century. And again, looking at this Baroque artwork through the book, keep that in mind. Listen to how music has changed over the course of the material from week 2, and then look at how that artwork has changed. Look at the final paintings of Unit 2, and then go back and look at the earliest paintings of Unit 2. So much more detail, so much richer, so much more lifelike. I think you'll find that the music tracks that. Instrumental music continues to rise, so I mentioned earlier that we'd come back to instrumental music. So really there are 3 reasons instrumental music begins to take off. One is for dance forms. We have people who are dancing, we need music for them to dance to, so the instrumental music plays that, but eventually the music becomes popular without the dancing. So we have these dance types that are first played so that people can dance to it, and then they're played on their own. Virtuosity. Virtuosity is just being like the absolute best musician, and it's competitive, and it's like, how good can you be? And then, of course, we have vocal music that was played on instruments. So you might have 2 vocal parts, 2 high vocal parts, 2 low vocal parts. Well, let's put that on 2 violins and 2 cellos, or a violin, viola, and 2 cellos, something like that. So those are the 3 ways that instrumental music takes off. Originally for dance, but then becomes its own popular form. Just because its virtuosity gives people an opportunity to show what they can do. And then, of course, the vocal music began to be played on instruments. One of the really interesting articles is this Final Global Perspectives, which talks about the African ostinato forms. And you see that picture of this really cool instrument, very similar to a guitar. That's that kora. It just has all these string instruments, and you pluck it. Very interesting. One of my music teachers, one of my ethnomusicology music teachers, actually played the kora. He had one in his office. It's a remarkable instrument. Sounds pretty cool. It sure looks like a guitar, but it doesn't really sound like a guitar. It's similar. It has a similar timbre, but the way it's played makes it sound very different. Anyway, that's just a very quick-ish guided tour through some of the key concepts of Unit 2. Have a great week. I look forward to reading your reaction papers. We're going to compare and contrast some material, as well as going through your quizzes. So any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, good luck. I'll see you next week.